Many people even wonder, are their children even real?
From 1688 to the present, all royal births have been incontrovertibly relied upon. This did not happen with Archie or Lilibet's birth. The two births are shrouded in secrecy. The monarch has a duty to ensure that there is no doubt as to the entitlement of each person who is closely in the line of succession.
Sit with that question for a few moments and really let it settle in your mind. Is there something fundamentally off here? It is not just a passing thought. It is not even a simple matter of wanting to know more details. The core pressing question being voiced by those who have dedicated years to closely monitoring every single move of this family is quite stark. Are the arrivals of Archie and Lilibet truly what we have been told they are? This is not a query that any reasonable person throws around without careful thought, and is certainly not one that simply dissipates into the air once it has been raised. Yet, that is exactly what keeps occurring over and over for 6 straight years. A question of this magnitude, of this seriousness, has surfaced time after time, and somehow not once has the one household with the absolute power to put it to rest with a single, clear sentence ever chosen to do so. Today, we are diving deep into the reasons why this specific question refuses to vanish, and what it is currently costing Meghan Markle behind the scenes as the long-term consequences of this narrative finally start to catch up with her. Because this has moved well beyond the realm of random, scattered internet gossip. This is now about the inevitable fallout when a matter this grave is left entirely unanswered for 6 full years. While the 2 children at the heart of this mystery continue to grow older, the weight of the silence only grows heavier, and the individuals raising these questions are becoming more confident, not less. Lady Colin Campbell, perhaps more than almost anyone else actively covering the saga, has been strikingly consistent regarding where she believes the ultimate responsibility for this silence resides. Meghan Markle utilized a surrogate that has been a point posited literally for well over 3 years when it comes to her firstborn son, Archie, and even her daughter, Lilibet. Hugo is extremely cautious. Hugo, which I am certainly not. I do not need to be. I can call a spade a spade. But also, Hugo is, by saying what he has said, what Hugo is actually conveying is that the birth has raised serious questions of fraudulence, because you cannot biologically give birth after you have already given birth. Nearly 300 years. That is exactly how far back this specific, time-honored tradition stretches. Every single royal birth in the line of succession was historically witnessed and confirmed by individuals whose credibility could not reasonably be called into question. This was not some arbitrary old-fashioned formality either. It was a fundamental safeguard built directly into the institution after Britain very nearly lost its entire monarchy over exactly this kind of doubt back in the late 1600s. Think deeply about what that actually implies. Every other royal birth in living memory, Princess Beatrice's children, Princess Eugenie's children, every single arrival in the modern royal family followed this exact, established pattern. No controversy, no hesitation, no pushback from the parents involved. Archie and Lilibet, according to Lady Colin Campbell, are the lone, glaring exceptions. And in an institution built almost entirely on precedent, where what has always been done must continue to be done because the stakes of getting it wrong are simply far too high, a single unexplained deviation rarely stays a minor footnote for long. It becomes exactly the kind of persistent question that keeps resurfacing year after year until somebody finally addresses it directly. That is the massive gap keeping this story alive for 6 years instead of letting it quietly fade away the way most royal controversies do. It is not disputed evidence. It is a documented, glaring absence of the standard confirmation every other royal child has received without a single question. So I have felt that they haven't been really together for a very long time. They turn up for photo ops to make it look like, it is brand Sussex, whatever. But you can just tell there is a deep, palpable tension between the couple. Let us talk about exactly why that absence of transparency has never been corrected, and why the heavy silence surrounding it may be considerably harder for Meghan to manage than anything else she has encountered since leaving the royal family. Because by virtually every account, Meghan has weathered plenty of storms over these past 6 years. Criticism regarding wardrobe choices, failed high-profile business ventures, public appearances that never seemed to land quite right. None of it, by most accounts, has proven quite as difficult to outlast as this one. And that detail alone is worth pausing on, because a question this simple to answer, if there were truly nothing to answer, should have been closed within a single news cycle, not left wide open for 6 straight years. The reaction here, if the reporting is accurate, suggests something considerably more sensitive and fraught than the usual tabloid noise. And once you understand precisely what is being alleged, it becomes a lot easier to see why. Consider how the royal family has historically handled genuinely baseless rumors. Rumors about affairs, invented feuds, or ridiculous scandals that sweep through the tabloid press. When something is simply not true, the response tends to be swift, decisive, and confident. A brief denial, sometimes through official channels, sometimes through a silence so total it communicates its own utter dismissiveness. What we are seeing here looks nothing like that. This is where the story stops being merely Lady Colin Campbell's perspective and transforms into something considerably harder to dismiss as just one biographer's personal theory. Because Hugo Vickers is not exactly known for reckless speculation, he is one of the most cautious, most carefully sourced royal historians working today. A man who built his entire reputation on precision rather than provocation. And according to Lady Colin Campbell, even Hugo Vickers is careful and measured. It is as simple as that. They need to clear it up, and it is very simple. If those children were not born of surrogates, they can make a single announcement, and the whole issue, is put to bed once and for all. And if they fail to make that announcement, it implies that something has occurred that should not have occurred, and they need to clear it up sooner rather than later. Never one to overstate a claim, he has been willing to use language pointing toward fraudulence regarding the timeline of this birth. When the most careful, measured voice in the room starts choosing words that serious, you have to stop and ask yourself why. Because here is the uncomfortable reality. You cannot give birth after you have already given birth. That is not royal gossip. That is simply how time and biology work. And if the timeline genuinely does not add up, if the dates once laid out plainly simply do not make logical sense, then no amount of palace silence is going to make that underlying problem disappear on its own. This is precisely the kind of granular detail that explains why this story has refused to die the way most controversies eventually do. It is not built on a single disputed photograph or one unreliable anonymous tip. It is built, according to those raising it, on a timeline that multiple independent voices, not just one outspoken biographer, but a notoriously cautious historian as well, have separately concluded simply does not hold together. And there is something genuinely significant about the specific way Lady Colin Campbell describes Hugo Vickers' involvement here. She does not claim he has gone as far as she is publicly in stating his own conclusions. She is, in fact, careful to draw a clear line between her own willingness to speak plainly and his far more measured, cautious approach to the same underlying material. But that distinction, rather than weakening her case, arguably strengthens it because it suggests two people operating with very different temperaments and very different appetites for risk, independently arriving at conclusions that point in broadly the same direction. Meghan's behavior has been such that she has put the royal family in a no-win situation, but she is very adept at putting people into no-win situations. The only thing is, her adversaries or her targets are always in a lose-lose situation. But Meghan then is not able to convert the fruit of her machinations into anything positive. That is not how baseless rumors typically spread. Baseless rumors need increasingly reckless voices to stay alive because cautious, credible people instinctively steer clear of claims that cannot survive basic scrutiny. The fact that a historian as careful as Hugo Vickers has been willing to engage with this question at all, in any form, tells you something vital about how seriously it deserves to be taken, regardless of how the palace has chosen to respond. And this is where the fallout becomes genuinely personal rather than simply institutional, because the strain this story has reportedly placed on Meghan and Harry's marriage did not begin yesterday. According to those who have tracked this couple's public appearances closely over recent years, the warning signs have been visible for a considerable time. Visible enough that even casual observers have started commenting on a tension that carefully managed photo opportunities can no longer fully conceal. Photo ops can manufacture a great deal. What they cannot manufacture indefinitely is genuine ease between two people. And according to multiple voices watching this couple's body language and public chemistry closely, the gap between the polished Sussex brand performance and the private reality has been widening for some time now. A gap that a story this explosive, landing on top of an already strained marriage, was always going to push wider rather than help repair. She is like a rat that is enclosed in a courtyard of cement and knows that there is food behind the wall, and it is desperately thrashing around, going here, there, and everywhere, trying to find a way in because it smells the food. It wants the food, but it does not manage to get access to the food. Is the surrogacy story solely responsible for whatever tension exists in this marriage? Almost certainly not. By every account, this couple's challenges run considerably deeper and predate this particular controversy by years. But sources close to the situation have suggested the story this serious, landing during a period of strain that was already being noticed by outside observers, does not exactly help matters. If anything, it adds one more genuine pressure point to a relationship that, according to those watching closely, may already have been running low on the reserves needed to absorb it. There is a particular weight to the timing of all this. A couple already navigating well-documented strain, already facing repeated questions about whether their marriage will survive life outside the royal family, now facing one more deeply uncomfortable question layered on top of everything else. A question that, unlike most sources of tension between two people, cannot simply be resolved through private conversation or quiet compromise, because it concerns something that either did or did not happen 6 and 4 years ago respectively, in a way that no amount of relationship work can retroactively change. Most tensions between two people can, with enough effort, be worked through over time. This one cannot simply be worked through. It can only ever be answered or left permanently unanswered. And 6 years of evidence suggests which path has so far been chosen. Notice what Lady Colin Campbell is and is not saying here. She is not claiming the surrogacy allegations are confirmed fact. She is making a considerably narrower and in some ways more damning point that the resolution has always been available, has always been simple, and has never once been taken. One announcement, one piece of paper. That is literally all it would take to shut this whole thing down for good. And 6 years later, it still has not happened. Let that sink in for a second. One simple statement could have protected those children from years of public scrutiny, taken massive pressure off a marriage that is clearly cracking at the seams, and buried this story permanently. Instead, silence. 6 years of pure, deliberate silence, and somehow that is supposed to be the smarter move. Now here is where it gets truly wild. Meghan and Harry have spent years positioning themselves as the ultimate champions of transparency. They have gone on record demanding accountability from everyone around them, calling out institutions, airing grievances publicly, building their entire brand around radical honesty. But the one moment, the single moment where one honest sentence could have ended everything? As her clout dwindled, as people lost interest in what she and Harry had going on, she was going to move to the next generation. And that was the final card she had to play. Archie and Lilibet? Crickets. Lady Colin Campbell has been asking the same question for years now, and nobody has given her a straight answer. Not about whether the allegations are true, just about why the simplest exit door in the room has been completely ignored for 6 straight years. And according to Lady Colin Campbell, this is not some isolated mistake from Meghan. This is a pattern, a very specific, very calculated pattern that leaves everyone around her stuck. Critics cannot fully prove anything. Supporters cannot get a clean denial. And the whole messy cycle just keeps spinning year after year, with nobody coming out ahead. The most loyal Meghan defenders will tell you that engaging with these questions only gives them power, that silence is the strategic play here. But 6 years of evidence has blown that theory apart completely. This story has not faded. It has gotten louder, reached wider audiences, and pulled in more serious voices. All because that one simple answer never came. The whisper circulating among royal insiders right now is that the reason for all this silence is not nearly as strategic as Meghan's team wants people to believe. It might actually be far simpler and far more damaging than anyone is ready to say out loud. And the surrogacy question is just one piece of a much bigger, more complex picture. Multiple commentators are now pointing to a broader pattern of desperate moves to stay relevant as Meghan's public pull continues to shrink. Moves that, according to Lady Colin Campbell, are becoming more visible and more transparent by the day, and still are not working. The harder the effort, the more visible the desperation becomes, and the less each attempt actually lands. But why does any of this connect back to a story about 2 children's births? Because behavior patterns never exist in isolation. Lady Colin Campbell is not pointing to one random incident. She is mapping a recurring shape across years of public moves. A shape that keeps showing up every single time relevance starts slipping away. And when the same pattern repeats across enough different situations, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like character. Because as Meghan's public profile has cooled, as interest in her various projects has visibly dried up, observers have increasingly pointed to something uncomfortable, that her own children have become the next card available to play. The freshest, most sympathetic asset left once everything else has been exhausted. Is that a harsh characterization? Absolutely. But it becomes a lot harder to dismiss once you place it alongside everything else already laid out here. Selective transparency, warmth deployed strategically rather than genuinely. Difficult questions met with everything except a straight answer. Once you see that pattern clearly in one place, you cannot unsee it anywhere else. And this is exactly where the surrogacy question and the children card theory start overlapping in a way that should make anyone paying attention genuinely uncomfortable. Meghan is now becoming aware of the fact that she cannot be the face of a brand because she is so toxic. So I think the whole thing is, yet again, another study in hopefulness on Meghan's behalf. And as usual, she gets it wrong. Because if Archie and Lilibet have indeed become a central asset for maintaining public relevance, then 6 years of refusing to simply clarify the basic facts of their birth starts carrying a very different, very troubling explanation. Maybe the silence persists not because clarifying would be hard, but because the ambiguity itself, the unresolved mystery, the slow burn of public doubt, generates exactly the kind of sustained attention that a definitive answer would immediately shut down for good. And this is where the consequences become genuinely difficult to look past. Whatever eventually gets confirmed, clarified, or proven completely false about the circumstances surrounding their births, Archie and Lilibet did not choose any part of this. They did not choose the secrecy, the speculation, or the deeply strange position of having the basic facts of their own existence endlessly debated across royal media for the entirety of their young lives. There is something worth pausing on here. Beyond the palace politics and the marriage strain, Archie is 7 now. Lilibet is 5. They're old enough soon to start encountering fragments of this conversation themselves. Old enough to eventually turn to their own parents and ask the very questions millions of strangers have been asking on their behalf for years. And what does a parent say when those questions finally arrive and the truth has never been told to anyone? Those who have followed this story closely suggest that question, unspoken and avoided, may be the real engine behind so much of the secrecy surrounding this family from the very beginning. This is precisely why Lady Colin Campbell describes this as a running sore rather than a settled controversy. A wound that has never properly closed, quietly festering beneath the surface no matter how many news cycles pass without resolution. And running sores do not heal simply because everyone agrees to stop looking at them. They heal only when someone finally, deliberately addresses what is underneath. Because a genuinely resolved controversy, even an ugly one, eventually scars over and stops causing fresh damage. What Lady Colin Campbell is describing is something very different. An injury that has never been allowed to heal, generating new pain with every resurfacing because the wound itself was never properly treated. 6 years of silence has not been treatment. By her account, it has simply been 6 years of that wound continuing to fester just beneath a surface that keeps cracking open enough for the rest of us to see exactly how unresolved it truly remains. Which brings us to perhaps the most quietly devastating part of this entire story. Hugo and I have many connections in common, and I mean this has been a running sore within the royal family for years, and the mere fact that Hugo is confirming it shows how very close to bursting point that overblown balloon is. Not the politics, not the constitutional mechanics, but the simple human reality facing 2 children growing up further and further removed from the wider royal family year after year, with no clear path back toward the cousins, the shared memories, and the sense of belonging that every other child in that family currently enjoys without a second thought. Whatever the eventual resolution to this story turns out to be, a long overdue public clarification, a quiet behind-the-scenes correction, or simply more of the same prolonged silence that has defined the last 6 years, one thing remains impossible to argue against. Archie and Lilibet are the 2 people in this entire saga who never asked for any of it, never chose it, never had any say in it whatsoever, and they are the ones who will carry the weight of it the longest, regardless of how it is ultimately settled. And that reality, stripped of all the palace politics, the biographer commentary, the body language analysis, and the constitutional history, is the detail that sits heaviest once everything else has been said. Because we have covered a lot of ground here. We have talked about a nearly 300-year-old tradition that exists for a very specific reason. A safeguard built directly into the institution after Britain very nearly lost its monarchy over exactly this kind of doubt. We have talked about what it means that every single royal birth in living memory followed that tradition without hesitation, without controversy, without a single moment of resistance from the parents involved. And we have talked about what it means that two births, and only two births, stand as the unexplained exception to that entire pattern. We have talked about Hugo Vickers, one of the most carefully sourced, most cautious royal historians working today. A man who built his entire reputation on precision rather than provocation. And what it means when even a voice that measured starts using language that points towards serious questions about the timeline. When the most careful person in the room starts choosing words that loaded, you do not get to simply wave it away as fringe gossip. We have talked about the mathematics of it, the simple, uncomfortable, entirely non-negotiable reality that you cannot give birth after you have already given birth. That is not a royal controversy. That is not tabloid spin. That is just how time works. And if the timeline does not add up, if the dates laid out plainly simply do not make logical sense, then no amount of silence from any palace anywhere is going to make that underlying problem disappear on its own. We have talked about what Lady Colin Campbell has been saying consistently, not for weeks or months. Children will completely be isolated with no real tight bond to that royal image that has made Harry who he still is today. Seeing Charlotte and George and all the cousins getting together and, learning things about each other, having those childhood memories together. And his children will have who? Nobody. But for years about where the responsibility for this silence ultimately sits, about how the resolution has always been available, has always been simple. One announcement, one piece of routine documentation, the exact same thing every other royal birth has produced without drama, without controversy, without anyone even needing to ask twice. And about how that one simple step in 6 full years has never once been taken. We have talked about the pattern, the wider, more uncomfortable pattern that extends far beyond any single controversy. The recurring shape that Lady Colin Campbell and multiple other commentators have now identified across years of public behavior. Selective transparency deployed strategically. Warmth switched on and off depending on what the moment requires. Difficult questions met with everything except a straight, clean, direct answer. And what it means when that same pattern shows up again and again across enough different contexts that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like something considerably more deliberate. We have talked about the strain, the visible, documented, increasingly difficult to ignore strain on a marriage that was already showing cracks before this particular story added its weight. The gap between the carefully managed public performance and what multiple observers describe as a private reality that those performances can no longer fully conceal. Photo opportunities can manufacture a great deal, but they cannot manufacture genuine ease between two people. And according to those watching this couple most closely, that ease has been visibly harder to find for some time now. So here is the question worth genuinely sitting with. Not a rhetorical question, not a talking point, a real question that cuts to the heart of everything this story is actually about underneath all the constitutional history, the biographer commentary, and the royal protocol that has framed every single piece of this conversation. If a question this serious were hanging over your own children, growing louder rather than quieter with every year that passed, following them into every room, attaching itself to every public mention of their names, would you not want it answered? Not for your own reputation, not for your brand, not for any strategic calculation about what silence versus engagement might cost you publicly, but simply for them, for the two people at the center of it who carry it the heaviest and had the least say in any of it. And do you believe, having seen everything laid out here, that Meghan Markle's continued silence on this story, 6 years deep and still going, tells us more about who she genuinely is and what she genuinely values than almost anything else she has done or said since the day she walked away from royal life? Those are not easy questions. They are not meant to be. But they are the questions that sit at the very center of this story. And they are questions that, unlike so much else surrounding this entire controversy, only one person on Earth has the power to answer definitively and finally put to rest. Let us be honest about what we have actually witnessed across 6 full years of this story. We started with a nearly 300-year-old tradition, one built not out of stuffy royal formality, but out of hard, painful institutional memory. A safeguard created because the stakes of getting it wrong were simply too high to leave unprotected. Every royal birth in living memory honored that tradition without drama, without resistance, without a single parent in that family ever pushing back on it. And then 2 births happened, and suddenly the tradition that had survived every scandal, every war, every constitutional crisis Britain had faced across 3 centuries just stopped. That alone would be worth a raised eyebrow. But it did not stop there, because the silence that followed was not just institutional. It was personal. It was strategic. And according to Lady Colin Campbell and Hugo Vickers, two voices operating with very different temperaments and very different reputations on the line, it pointed towards something that neither baseless rumors nor simple royal stubbornness can fully explain away. Hugo Vickers did not build his entire career on being reckless. He built it on being right. Carefully, methodically, sourced to the bone, right? So when even a voice that measured and that cautious starts choosing words that point towards serious questions about a birth timeline, you're not dealing with tabloid noise anymore. You are dealing with something that serious, credible people have looked at directly and decided deserves to be taken seriously. That is not nothing. That is actually everything. And then there is the mathematics of it. The part that no amount of palace spin or carefully worded non-response can actually touch. You cannot give birth after you have already given birth. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is not a royal grudge being played out in public. That is simply how time works. And if the timeline does not add up, if the dates laid out plainly and honestly simply do not make logical sense, then no press release, no choreographed photo opportunity, and no 6-year strategy of dignified silence is going to make that underlying problem disappear on its own. What makes this story genuinely different from the usual churn of royal controversy is not the allegation itself. It is the response to it, or more accurately, the complete and total absence of one. Because we know how the royal world handles genuinely baseless claims. We have seen it enough times to recognize the pattern. A brief, confident denial, silence so complete it communicates its own dismissiveness, a swift institutional response that makes the original claim look foolish for ever having been raised. That is what happens when something is simply not true. That is not what happened here. What happened here was 6 years of a story growing louder, pulling in more credible voices, reaching wider audiences, and finding fresh oxygen with every single passing year. All while the one family with the power to end it in a single sentence chose again and again and again to say absolutely nothing. That is not how innocent people respond to false accusations. And deep down, everyone paying attention already knows it. Now place that silence directly alongside the brand Meghan and Harry have spent those same 6 years constructing. The speech is about radical honesty. The sit-down interviews framed around the courage it takes to speak truth to power. The carefully built public identity resting almost entirely on the promise of transparency, of saying the hard thing, the real thing, the thing that others are too afraid or too compromised to say out loud. That brand was powerful once. It moved people. It generated genuine sympathy and genuine support from audiences who believed in what was being sold to them. But a brand built on radical honesty has a very specific vulnerability. It cannot survive radical silence on the one question that matters most. And the contrast between everything Meghan has said publicly about transparency and the 6-year wall of silence surrounding her own children's most basic facts is not subtle. It is not something casual observers miss. It is, in fact, the single most glaring contradiction in an entire public narrative built on contradictions. And it is the one contradiction that no carefully managed press tour, no new streaming project, and no choreographed moment of stage vulnerability is ever going to smooth over. Because here is what cuts through every layer of palace politics, every piece of biographer commentary, every frame of body language analysis, and every constitutional history lesson. Archie is 7 years old. Lilibet is 5. They are real children growing up in real time at the center of a conversation that the adults around them have spent 6 full years refusing to resolve. They did not choose this. They did not sign up for it. They have no power to end it. And every single year that passes without resolution is another year those two children grow closer to being old enough to encounter this story themselves, to stumble across it, to ask about it, to look their parents in the eye and want a real answer. What does a parent say in that moment? What do you tell a child when the truth has been kept from everyone, including, according to those closest to this story, the people who should have been the first to know? That question, quietly devastating and consistently avoided by everyone with the power to address it, may be the single most important thread running underneath everything else in this entire saga. Not the constitutional mechanics, not the marriage strain, as visible and as real as that strain has become, but two children growing older every year, carrying the weight of a story that was never theirs to carry in the first place. Lady Colin Campbell, calls this a running sore for a reason. Not a controversy that burned hot and faded into settled history. Not a scandal that peaked and moved on. A wound that has never been allowed to properly close, generating fresh damage with every resurfacing, festering quietly beneath a surface that keeps cracking open just enough for the rest of the world to see exactly how unresolved it truly remains. And running sores do not heal through silence. They do not heal through time alone. They heal only when someone finally, honestly, deliberately addresses what is actually underneath. 6 years of evidence has made it abundantly clear which choice has been made here. And it has not been that one. The most uncomfortable truth in this entire story is also the simplest one. One sentence, one document. The same routine confirmation that every other royal birth has produced without drama, without resistance, without anyone even needing to ask twice. And this story closes permanently. That option has existed from day one. It exists right now, today, in this very moment. And 6 years of choosing silence over that one simple step is not a communication strategy. It is not dignity. It is not strength. It is a choice. And choices, especially ones made consistently across 6 full years, always end up revealing exactly what they were meant to conceal. So drop your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to know where you stand on all of this. Tell us what you think the silence means. Tell us whether you believe a resolution is still coming, or whether 6 years of evidence has already told us everything we need to know. This is exactly the kind of story where the comment section hits different, and your perspective genuinely matters here. If this gave you something real to think about, hit that like button. It helps this kind of deep, carefully researched content reach the people who need to see it most. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because stories exactly like this one, covered at this level of depth, are what this channel is built on. And you do not want to be the last person in the room when the next chapter of this story finally breaks. Share this with someone who has been following this story closely, or someone who has never heard of it but deserves to know what has been sitting completely unanswered for 6 straight years. Because as everything covered here has shown, you are very far from alone in asking these questions. And the more people asking them out loud, the harder they become for anyone to keep ignoring. See you in the next one.